for any question in logical reasoning, right, my number one goal is first to read and understand what the argument is, and then two, to figure out what is wrong with the argument, assuming it is an argument. And the way I figure out what's wrong with it is I look at the conclusion and I try to figure out why that conclusion is not proven by the evidence. Now, in some cases it is, but since we're going to end up doing flaw questions tonight, in theory, none of these arguments should be legit. So there has to be some problem. So that means that there's not enough evidence. We need more evidence to get to the conclusion. One thing that you can look at, if you're reading an argument and you're trying to understand it as best you can, and you get to the conclusion, which could be at the beginning or at the end, but whenever you are looking at that conclusion and you're trying to decide whether it's proven by the evidence, does anyone know some common things that make that conclusion bad, or things that you could focus on in the conclusion to help you find out what's wrong with that argument? Selena, you said introducing new information, and that's exactly right. Any new information in the conclusion is a problem. For an argument to be valid, the evidence has to prove the conclusion. So if the conclusion starts talking about new stuff, things that weren't mentioned in the evidence, well, then by definition, you don't have enough evidence to get to that conclusion. And then you can work a little bit backward and say, okay, this was new. What part of the evidence did the author try to connect this to, right? Sometimes the information is so new that you don't even see how it relates to the evidence. Oddly enough, when that happens, when the information in the conclusion is so out of left field, some people are actually more disoriented because they can't even see what the author was trying to get at. But of course, that argument is horrendously flawed because you can't get to that conclusion. In a lot of cases, the new information connects back to something in the argument, just not directly, right? It connects back in some way that kind of makes sense to you, and so you might not even notice that it's new information. But if you're reading very strictly, when you read the conclusion, if you see something that was not literally mentioned in the evidence, then you should start thinking very carefully about whether they were able to mention that safely. So new information in a conclusion. Also, sometimes a conclusion will not necessarily introduce new information, but it will take the information that was given in the evidence too far, right? So the evidence is maybe talking about what's true for most people or what usually happens, and then the conclusion foolishly says something like, oh, this is true for everyone. Well, it's like, okay, well, we were talking about, at least you're staying on topic, but you went from evidence that's a little bit weaker to a conclusion that's a little bit stronger, and you can't do that. So in general, when I'm looking at the conclusion and trying to figure out what's wrong with it, I'm looking for new information or information that's overstated, right? Sometimes talking about conclusions and premises and evidence and all that can get your mind actually distracted from what you need to do. And what you need to do is first make sure you're understanding what the other person is saying. And then once you understand it, you can really start to engage with whether or not the evidence provided was enough. If you just start thinking about, oh, is the evidence enough, or is the conclusion introducing new information? Sometimes it's like you're approaching the question too abstractly, and you don't have the understanding of what's being said to really be in a position to evaluate it. So I want to explain to you what we're doing. At the same time, I don't want you to obsess about that. I want you to first and foremost just forget everything I just said and focus on understanding the argument, and then worry about all this other stuff if the flaw doesn't stick out to you, right? This is more like, oh, okay, it just told me it's a flaw question, and yet here I am thinking this argument sounds good enough. How do I solve that? Well, you could start by looking at the conclusion and seeing if there's any new information or overstated information.